Greetings, everyone, and welcome to The Future of Web Layout. My name is Jeremy Osborne. I'm the Academic Director of Aquin Gymnasium, which you can find at thegymnasium.com. And here is our brief plug. What do? We offer free online courses on topics such as web design, front-end development, user experience, and much more. And this webinar is the latest in our series of discussions with notable figures in the creative web development industry. And today I'm joined by two of those esteemed professionals, Rachel Andrew and Jason Pimentel. I'm going to do some formal introductions in just a moment, but let's just talk a little bit about the format. So I'll be talking with Rachel and Jason for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end to take questions from everyone attending. We do have a gymnasium staff in the background available for technical support as to the degree that we can give it. There is a Q&A or a question and answer button in your webinar panel. So you can feel free to add those questions at any point, and we'll go from there. Primarily, I'll be answering those at the end. So let's talk a little bit about our guests. We have Rachel Andrew, who is a front and back end web developer, speaker, author, co-author of 22 books, including the new CSS Layout, a regular contributor to a number of publications, both on and offline, co-founder of the CMS Perch, editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine, a Google developer expert, and an invited expert to the CSS Working Group. You can find Rachel at rachelandrew.co.uk and also on the Twitters as Rachel Andrew. Hi, Rachel. Welcome, and thanks for coming on.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
You're welcome. And then we have Jason Pimentel, design strategist, speaker, and typographer who has been leading design and development for over 20 years, author of Responsive Typography for O'Reilly. Jason leads strategy, design, and development at isovera.com and teaches workshops, speaks to teams and events worldwide. And you can find Jason on the Twitters as J Pimentel. Hello, sir. How are you?
Good. We're we're just waiting for the snow to come.
Yes, I should point out that so Jason and I are in the Northeast in our home bunkers where we are experiencing another Northeaster. This is the third in 2 weeks here in New England. So hopefully we can hold on for an hour. So we'll see. Okay, well, so what I wanted to jump into, so this is a discussion about the future of web layout. And to kind of put that in context, I think it'd be worthwhile to talk just a little bit about the context of some of the new developments in layout. And so, for our audience, it's possible that some of you were around when we designed websites with tables, which all of us here on the call certainly were. And then tables kind of transitioned to CSS, and that took a long time, or it felt like a really long time. And it almost feels like we're at the precipice of another advance in layout, and that really is this kind of combination of Flexbox and grid layout in particular. And I guess the first question I have for both folks, and I'll kind of throw this to Rachel first, but it felt to me like, when we made that transition from table-based layout to CSS layout, it felt like it took a really long time. Browsers took a while to get up to date with all of the spec. This feels different. This feels like it's happening faster. Would you agree with that, or what's the reasoning for that?
I think the thing with the tables to CSS transition, people weren't using CSS, or they were using it for very small things, styling text and what have you. So, they were using CSS to change the color of text and so on. Mm-hmm. And so I think it took a long time because we're actually asking people to adopt an entirely new way of working, a completely new way of working, learn a new language. That's what we were asking people to do. Right. And it didn't actually, I think to a lot of people, it seemed almost like a step backwards as well, because the layouts we were doing with CSS were simpler than the layouts we were doing with tables. And I've said before that I think that a lot of what we say is kind of web design, is web-like, actually stems from that technical limitation. We had a limitation of what we could do with floats and absolute positioning, which is all we had. And so we ended up with these very simple looking designs. I think now what's happening with something like Grid and Flexbox, it's actually saying, hey, look, you can do all these new things. And you don't have to learn a brand new language. You can start doing some of this new stuff by learning just a few of the properties of Grid, for example. And you can start doing some, say, a component to your design that relies on white space or relies on content distribution, which you couldn't do before. But you don't have to learn absolutely everything to do that. You can just start to adopt little bits as you work. And so I think we're starting to see more people quickly adopt this stuff, but maybe they're just adopting it in small ways. They're not completely... Because it's not a case of, oh, I now need to design all my sites using Grid. You know, I made a very conscious decision back in the early days of CSS Layout that I was not going to build sites using tables for layout because I'd moved away from that. And that was quite a big decision. You know, that impacted everything that I built. Whereas, you know, using Grid Layout, it's like, oh, well, it suits this component. It works with the browsers we've got. I'll have a go. So it's a very different sort of thing. We're just transitioning the way we work as opposed to having to learn something completely new and totally replace everything.
I think, you know, one of the things that sort of struck me in just actually watching your talks over the last couple of years and the stuff that you've put out on like Grid by Example was having started working on the web early on and studying graphic design. Tables to me actually were a way to work with a grid. And I think there are some people who looked at that and then struggled with CSS. I know I did. I mean, I adopted it, but I could never really think in the same way of like a whole structure. And grid is sort of a relief in that it's like, oh, okay, so that's, you know, that's the previous analog. It's like the better way of, you know, how I used to try to work with tables, which was an adaptation of the same way I would work in print. And then this has the advantage of all of these other elements of grid gap and the way you can use it a component at a time. That's so much more flexible. It sort of simultaneously kind of allows you to bring an older, I don't know, a previously learned way of thinking about layout and design and print into an adaptation that works much better on the web. So I don't know. I mean, I think this actually has the potential to open the doors more for people who have a more traditional graphic design education to be able to apply what they learned to the web in a little bit easier way. I mean, at least I hope so.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, let's take a step back too, so that, you know, so there are probably a lot of folks watching who have heard about grid layout and maybe played around with it, but maybe just heard about it. So it probably is worth just taking that step back and just discussing, like, what is it? What, Rachel, if you could kind of take that and, you know, the simplest. I know that there's. So I'll just kind of preface this. So, you know, grid layout is a new addition to the Css Spec, which gives you a whole bunch of new CSS selectors and rules that you can use to create interesting layouts. But that's the high level. Rachel, what's your elevator pitch for grid layout? How do you describe that for folks who've never heard it before?
Okay, so grid layout is basically a two-dimensional grid system for web pages. So unlike everything else in CSS, where what we do is we kind of give things a size and we then kind of push them around to make them line up with each other. That's how web designers worked traditionally. Instead, with grid layout, what we do is we create a grid, and then the elements that are inside your grid container can be positioned on that grid, which gives us a couple of advantages. Firstly, they've all got relationship to each other. So if you've got two things next to each other, and the one on the right is taller than the one on the left, you can have them both visually look like they're the same height. That's quite useful. You can also do that sort of thing in Flexbox. But because we're two-dimensional, you can also kind of control white space in terms of rows. So you can leave an entire row empty if you want to. Or, you know, you can leave chunks of white space around your design, which was very, very difficult to do in the past because we were doing this kind of push things around and line them up approach to design, which is pretty fragile to start with, and not a very easy thing to think about doing. You're constantly having to work out, you know, have I got 100% of my space filled so that things don't end up in the wrong place? Whereas with grid, we can actually just say, hey, you know, I want this thing to be in this cell of the grid, please, and it will go there and it won't overlap other things because you've put it in its own cell. So it's very different to everything else you've had before.
So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to share my screen for a second. And this is a site, Rachel, that you put together called gridbyexample.com. So again, for folks who are interested in just seeing some examples, this is an excellent resource site. And again, if we look on examples, these are some abstract examples of how to build a grid. You have some examples of page layouts, so that, you know, if you're interested in looking at, you know, a 2-column responsive layout with a footer, then you can go ahead and check that out. So this is a excellent resource. And, you know, I would suggest for folks, we'll talk about, you know, ways that you can learn this, but, you know, let's focus again. So Jason, you know, what's your, when you first encountered grid layout, what was your reaction, and, you know, how do you think of it at the moment?
You know, I feel like I'm still learning, because I think while I've been fortunate enough to see Rachel give several talks about it over the last couple of years, I haven't had enough of a chance to really work with it myself on my own projects. But now that we are starting to put it into production on a couple of things at Isovera, every time I spend, or well, actually, another example is actually incorporating a bit of the examples into the responsive web design course that I worked on with you for Gymnasium. Just a brief introduction to grid there. Every time I pick it up, it makes more and more sense, and I start to see more and more applications for it. And I think that one of the things that I really loved when I started to learn more about it was the min and max values you can supply for an individual element, really replacing a lot of what many of us have been sort of clamoring for with container queries, which is, you know, really wanting to address the layout of a small piece of the layout, you know, one component of content, and change the way that behaves at different screen sizes, like having something lay out side by side on a wider screen, or when it's in a wider area, versus something that lines up vertically, you know, one thing over another, like a photo and a teaser text or title, when it's in a narrower area. And by nesting grids, so, you know, because as, you know, the grid declaration only applies to the immediate children. So you can have grid on a small component, like Rachel was saying, you can try it out in this one area and have it change its behavior based on min and max, and then have a larger sort of grid controlling the whole page. I mean, I'm just talking about the stuff that Rachel taught me. So I mean, but it's amazingly powerful. And that was what was eye-opening to me was it was just going through a couple of examples starts to open up your mind to how we've been hacking around at solutions for these things, like lining up blog post teasers in a card layout. And you work through the examples that Rachel put together and you realize you don't even need media queries for that. It's kind of astonishing how much less code you can write to achieve these same outcomes. That
was the thing that was one of the things that really jumped out when I started playing around with it. And it's interesting because so I had this really bizarre opportunity to use grid years ago when so it actually started off in the wheelhouse of Microsoft. And I had this strange project I did for Windows 8 in which they were doing a demo, and I was allowed to use Flexbox and grid because it was a sandbox. It only needed to be supported in Windows 8 systems. And so this was, this was a while. This was like 6 or 7 years ago. And I remember playing with it. And I'm like, holy cow! You can do. You can write 3 lines of code, and you can have this completely flexible, responsive layout that is smart. So it actually understands, you know, I'm simplifying a little bit, but it actually will allow you to generate new content sections based on what you're putting in there. So it's like it feels like an intelligent system. You have to give it some rules, but that was, that being able to create sophisticated layout with 3 to 4 lines of code is really pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean that was really how I came across Grid, was with the Microsoft implementation. I wrote some stuff about that because I was just really keen that it got some traction and it was something that became more widely used. But yeah, there were a bunch of people actually using that Microsoft version for various things, and you'd find people talking about it. Just wasn't really getting out into the web.
No, it wasn't, and it felt like, and it was still, very, had the MS prefix and all that stuff. So it felt very kind of isolated, but it broke out of its chains, and we're now working with it today. And I guess here, one of the things I've been kind of curious about is, so again, for the folks watching, let's take our word for it, if you haven't played around with it, that it's extremely efficient, allows developers and designers to kind of quickly create these layouts. My question is, we always are trying to keep the user at the center of design, or we should be. And so I guess my question is, will people using websites with grid layout, is there any difference? Like, what are the benefits for the users? If that's a fair question, I'm just kind of curious, what your takes on that are, or is there? Is it just completely invisible, and that users who are using a site with grid layout just won't know or care?
It should. I mean, any users shouldn't have to care about what is going on under the hood of the website. They should just be getting a good experience. I think that where it matters goes back to this issue of the fact we can do complicated stuff with a very few lines of code. Because what is noticed by users is if they end up with a horrible janky experience as things are trying to load in, or people are trying to do complex stuff, so they're using a lot of JavaScript to work out heights, and you end up with this nasty janky experience, particularly for users on more limited devices and browsers and so on. The nice thing with Grid is we can do very complicated layouts that would have been impossible without JavaScript before Grid. We would have had to be doing things like calculating heights and so on to do this stuff. So we're able to do these very complicated layouts with very little code and in a very performant way. And it's that actually benefits the users. It's not whether we can do this design or that design, or hopefully that stuff is completely transparent. Hopefully the users just see a really great website or a really useful application and they're getting on with it. What is good, though, is the fact that hopefully our stuff should be faster and more performant and rely less on sort of doing things in JavaScript that are expensive. Just to do visual effects. We should be doing all that stuff in the CSS in a really performant way. So that's what matters to users, not what technology that the web designer or developers used.
Yeah, I think to build on that, if we can do all of these things really simply with less code, it means that as designers and developers, we can spend more time on really refining the layout or exploring new layout ideas. When we're not spending so much time building the foundation, then we actually can spend time on a more meaningful experience. And so we can get away from some squishy boxes and actually think about real layout and not just doing what we can. I mean, I think it's really similar to, go back 10 years or more. Starting in like the late 90s, we would have to build the content management system before we could then start to think about designing the site. And so that was a truth, at least for me in my career, for 10 years before there were enough good open source alternatives or even commercial products to start to have that better content management foundation to then start, so you're not building a login system. I mean, this is an extension of that by not having to find polyfills, learn some JavaScript framework, and find all these ways to stitch it together to have the basics of a layout that we wanted. Then we could actually spend time on real design, like real thinking, real figuring out what do we do with a really big screen? What do we do on the small one? that's meaningful, that actually adds to the experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And I think, your point about like earlier about graphic designers, being able to now more easily execute kind of their vision in code. I think this is one of the other interesting pieces of Grid. And I believe, Jeffrey Zeldman was the first person to really kind of hit this home for me is that, some of the benefits of having simpler code is that it's going to allow people who maybe are not as code savvy right now and don't want to deal with, let's just say that the profile of someone who is primarily a UX designer.
Mm-hmm.
So again, there's lots of UX designers who are completely fluid in HTML, CSS, but there's also a fair number who aren't. And so for things like prototyping, I see Grid as kind of being this opening up this new world so that the ability to kind of quickly sketch out an interesting layout that you have in your head, if you're a UX designer or a graphic designer, is so much easier. If you want to create something with 3 rows and 2 columns, and then have one of those columns be 50% larger than the other one, like that's very simple to do. At the same time, it should also it should be noted that it's also really deep. Like there's a lot in that CSS Grid specification. I think I did a short article on it a few months ago, and I think we counted there's like 17 new CSS selectors. Does that sound right?
Properties, yeah. I mean, so there's a lot to it, but you don't actually need to use it all, and pretty much it all comes down to the same thing. I think that there's been a little bit of this kind of, it's so huge and so complicated, buy my course, going on, and it's not. And I think what I've discovered, because I've taught workshops now for nearly 3 years. I've been teaching Grid in workshops. I was teaching it long before it shipped into browsers, and people who were not already web developers grasp it immediately, like so quickly. It's so obvious. They're just doing it. They're building layouts. Anyone with web development experience is kind of having to make that shift from what we had before. And so in some ways, this is easier for people new to the industry, which is fascinating. And easier for people who, yes, are that designer. I've just come from LA where I was doing a workshop for user experience designers. And most of them, when I asked them what they wanted to get out of the workshop right at the beginning, they didn't want to learn to code. What they wanted to do was learn to be able to have conversations with their developers about the stuff they're designing. But by getting them sort of hands-on with the Grid code and with tools like the Firefox Grid Inspector and being able to actually play around and be able to see how grids looked on the screen, they then felt they'd be able to have these conversations with developers who are often telling them, oh, no, you can't do this on the web. They felt they'd be able to go back and say, well, actually, we can. We've got the ability to do some of this stuff. And that was really nice to sort of open up those ideas and see people going, oh, actually, yeah, we can do this stuff, and there's a way of doing it. And that was really good fun.
That was one of the biggest motivations in actually writing the book that I wrote about web typography, was to actually enable that conversation. And so I had sort of like these 3 different audiences in my head, like the graphics designers who knew typography but didn't know how to apply it or how much they could apply. UX designers who hadn't studied typography, give them an understanding of why it's important and what they can do with it. And then specifically for developers who very often would come back and I think are still saying that it's too big a performance problem, we're not going to do it. That's, we'll build in all the JavaScript frameworks and we'll do all of this other stuff. And we'll put your background video in place, but we're not going to load, 100K of web fonts. And like show them here, give them this code, show them this chapter, like this is how you can do it and do it well, performantly, and not kill the experience. And I think it is facilitating the conversation. I think that's what is the heart of all of this that I think is so powerful. Is just showing people what's possible and how to do it easily.
Yeah, and I want to actually talk about some of the other future pieces, including the typography piece. So, but before I do that, so again, just to kind of, I'm going to share my screen again here. A couple other resources for folks here. This is an example, and this maybe again is a more visual example. So another resource that is invaluable is the work of Jenn Simmons. And you can see some of the work that she's done at labs.jennsimmons.com. And this is an example of, again, at this point, it's becoming kind of a notoriously kind of famous example that she created like a year and a half ago. So this is a Mondrian responsive grid layout, which again, when you begin to change the width of the browser, you can kind of see how that grid actually kind of reshapes responsively, which is really kind of fantastic. And so in addition to that, I would also suggest that Jenn has a new channel called Layout Land, which is on YouTube. Huge resource, and I recommend if you want to learn not just about grid, but other interesting aspects of layout, such as the overlap and the clip path that are featured here. This is a great resource. So definitely check those out.
Any talks that you can see of Jenn's, like I'm not sure for how many years I've been seeing her talk about graphic design on the web, and that's, I feel like, I found a kindred spirit when I saw her first talk, and I'm so happy that I've gotten to get to know her at least a little bit over the years, because there are not many people who have such a firm grasp of really core graphic design concepts, but at the same time are so incredibly knowledgeable and fluent in the technology that enables it. So I mean, it is just an incredible resource, like everything that she's put out, and just such a great advocate for getting that back in the conversation, because I think for a long time, I think we can fairly say that graphic design has been kind of a dirty word on the web, and that's a shame. It really is.
Yep. Well, and the last thing I want, and the last thing I want to just I'm going to head off some of the questions that I suspect will be coming, and some of the ones we got, and this has to do with can I use it now? And that's not just a website. That's also just a general term. And so, again, one of the notable pieces, and I don't have this statistic memorized, Rachel, maybe you can help me, but I believe there was this moment, you had posted a tweet, I think like a year and a half ago, that indicated the amount of browser support for responsive web. And it went from like 0 to 80, 70. What was it? Can you remind me what that general number was?
Well, I mean, at the moment for grid, the sort of global can I use usage is 84, just over 84% of. Right. So that's basically all of the modern mainstream web browsers now support CSS grid layout. I-10 and 11 support the older Microsoft, the MS prefixed version. Right. So if you add them, it gets up to just over 87% of browsers. Obviously, you have to look at your own analytics to know what you've got, but the fallbacks, you can create fallbacks for CSS grid very, very nicely with things like feature queries and so on. I'll dig out an article. I wrote a whole bunch of this for Smashing Magazine, so I shall dig out a link and we can share that, just of how to do all the different fallbacks and things. But there's a lot you can do to create a good experience for people without grid, without needing to sort of rely on trying to make everything look identical.
Right. Yeah. And just to, go ahead, Jason.
Went from like 0 to 70+% in like a month.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just incredible.
It landed in all those browsers really at more or less the same time. So.
Yeah. So the short, exactly, and which is fantastic and amazing, and it's kind of one of the things that I was referencing at the very beginning about the difference between today, where we have this rapid adoption. Browsers are no longer being released like once every year and a half, right? We're now getting these constant updates and automatic updates and things like that. And again, so for the folks who are watching, and again, there's always this immediate question of like, yeah, this sounds great, but can I use it? And like the answer is like, yeah, you can. You don't necessarily have to build your entire website on it. Again, just as kind of a semi-plug and kind of example of that. So at thegymnasium.com, which of course has our sites, our designer Justin, created this little section here under our featured courses, which, oh look, Jason, there is your course on responsive web design fundamentals, conveniently nested within grid. So this entire 3-column section here and the section below. So this is like a little grid component within our homepage, which is actually based on Open edX. So it's an open source learning management system. So it's basically a content management system. But we were able to kind of put this little piece in here. It works excellent. There's no problems with older browsers because we do have some sort of fallback stuff that goes on. Now, again, I don't want to get too deep into the fallback thing because that's like almost a whole webinar or another component. But again, it's kind of worth noting that that there are some very robust ways to allow modern browsers to use the grid layout system, and older browsers you can kind of create different types of fallbacks. One other resource before we kind of switch topics a little bit, or two more. So again, Rachel sent me this link to Css Layout Dot news. So this is another resource where you can, this looks like an email newsletter. Is that correct, Rachel?
Yeah, it's my weekly email newsletter. Just anything about CSS layout, I send out tutorials and everything that I find when I'm reading stuff during the week.
Okay.
That's been a great reference.
Yeah, this is fantastic. And again, the other resource is Rachel's book, The New CSS Layout, which again talks, from our friends at A Book Apart, which talks a lot about some hands-on techniques for using that. So yeah, I definitely recommend, folks, if this isn't getting your kind of attention it should be, that these resources and the implementation of grid is just going to become more and more widespread. So again, in terms of so Jason, you had mentioned the typography piece earlier, and I've been teaching web design and graphic design to a certain degree for 15 years and more. And way back when I had my web design classes, I actually put in, which I can see would be a controversial statement, that typography actually is layout. Would you agree with that, or what is the does type just get poured into a layout, or is it the layout?
I think it's a little bit of yes to both aspects of that. I think primarily I consider the type layout in that type is relative to itself. So all the elements of type need to work together to establish a hierarchy and a visual rhythm. And so there are certain aspects of heading proportion to body copy to paragraph width, line height, that the distance between each line of text, and even distance between those elements. So there are aspects of layout that are part of it, and it all is related to conveying the meaning and accentuating the meaning and understanding of hierarchy and the content itself.
Mm-hmm.
But it also has to fit in context. So the flip side of that is, yes, you are pouring it into a layout where it will exist, but it can't then lose all of its own properties. So you put the text into a blog post that uses like Medium and so many other websites. It's a sort of centered column of text, and then you have other elements that may be wider or narrower. You still want the text to not get too wide so that it's hard to read. Right. So it can't completely adopt the properties of the layout that it's in, or else you could end up, and you see this on a lot of websites, where the layout expands as the window gets bigger, and then you have these lines of text that are a foot long. Right. And what happens is it gets really hard to read because your eye can't really follow all the way across this huge long line of text and then get back successfully to the beginning of the next line.
Right.
So it is definitely, it's a balance. It has to work well with the things around it, but ultimately, if it's text that's meant to be read, big long chunks of centered text is hard to read. Right. Really long line lengths are hard to read. So given that a lot of the web is words.
Right.
You have to start with the content and design for that, and then once it goes into the layout, you have to strike that balance of the layout of the page versus the comprehension of the text.
Right, and I think you also probably see, this is happening a little bit less frequently, but you also see kind of this opposite. We haven't really like dove into like mobile, right? And the fact that, if you're looking at the stats, more people are accessing the web via, phones and tablets and things like that than they are desktop. We've basically crossed that line depending on what stats you look at. So, you still have that opposite effect where you look at a website on your phone and that type may or may not be optimized for that tiny screen. In the worst case scenario, you've got the old school like full 3-column website that you have to pinch and zoom. Luckily, we're seeing a lot less of that. Thank goodness. But we're still seeing this. If people are designing type for the desktop screen still, and they're not considering the mobile experience, then that's a problem. So one of the things that are kind of on the horizon, and this really is kind of the future, because the support for this is slowly coming. So whereas grid you can use today, variable fonts. Let's just quickly talk about those, because to me the combination, like we're looking at a future. This is kind of my take on it. We're looking at a future where we can use something like variable fonts, which Jason will explain in a second, and grid, and kind of give you this like completely new experience in a way, and optimized again for the user who doesn't have to know what's happening, but things work. So what are variable fonts, Jason? You could explain.
John Hudson, a type designer, I think had one of the best phrases about it. It is one font that acts like many fonts. And so anyone that's worked with web fonts before or installed them in your local desktop knows that in order to get all the different ways you might use something like Franklin Gothic, you might be installing as many as 64 different files. For every single width and weight and slant or italic version of it, that's a different individual file. So regular, bold, italic, and bold italic, that's 4 right there. So on the web, that translates to file assets that have to be downloaded. And the variable font format is a new format that can contain all of that information in a single file, and do it in such a way that it is far more efficient than the sum of its parts. So it might be 100K to load those 4 files. It might only be 35 to load the variable font. And what's really remarkable is that you now have way more than those 4 options, because in that file, you can see and just use CSS to get every weight from the thinnest hairline to the fattest display version, from the narrowest condensed to the widest extended, even slant, and there's a whole slew of other axes of variation that you have available to you. And so that simultaneously gives us a much greater design vocabulary, along with a potentially much more performant implementation.
So yeah, you had sent me this. Yeah, that's excellent explanation. Thank you. So yeah, it's just kind of one font to rule them all, right? And so this is an example you sent me at v-fonts.com, which again kind of shows that you can scale the weight of the font. So there's a handy little slider here, as well as the width. And again, so there's a number of other fonts that allow you to do this. And so is the idea basically that how, I know I'm just doing this manually, but are these things that are tied into like the size of the screen, or how does that happen?
Well, that's the opportunity. So I think if you imagine the way we work with fonts now, for a heading, you might make the text much bigger and heavier. But that's not the only way to do it. You might, in some cases, want to make it really big and really fine lined. And we've had to make those choices on the web in order to deliver on a good user experience. I think that it's safe to say that most people would shy away from loading more than 100 to 150K worth of fonts, given all the other stuff that we're loading on a given page. Now, I think that you get a lot more for that load because they're cached and you can use them on every page, and it provides a significant amount of design voice for what you're loading. But that's in context in our modern environments with everything else that's being loaded. That's a frequent argument against loading more stuff. What's pretty common in print might be 10 plus different weights and variants in one magazine cover. So they're using all this great variety of width and weight to draw your attention in different ways and emphasize things in different ways. And we haven't gotten to do that.
Right.
We've been too constrained with performance. So while we've had all of these challenges with layout, we've also had all of these challenges in how do we create an interesting experience, one that really can draw you in. That's part of what I'll be talking about at an event apart
Cool.
next month in Seattle, is how we can gain that voice while addressing some of these performance concerns in ways that we've just never been able to do it before. Yeah,
that's awesome. We're about to take, so thank you for that. This is, I see these two, not just these two specifically, because there's lots of other pieces, but again, to me, what this points to is like a future in which, again, you can really start thinking about design. And again, if you want to have a multi-column grid on your 27-inch desktop that has custom fonts that are appropriate for that screen size, and that same website looks great when you bring it up on your phone, like truly great, like you really get to choose and design that experience, then this is kind of where we're headed.
That was one thing that I totally didn't get to. Addressing the small screen, like that, when you have access to all of the width and weight axes, we could make the letters just slightly narrower on the phone and get a better line length.
Right.
I mean, typically you end up with maybe only 35 or 40 characters per line, which is even fewer characters than you'd get in a newspaper column.
Right.
So it makes a really choppy experience. But if you make the characters just a tiny bit narrower, it's pretty easy to get another 10 characters per line. And all of a sudden your reading experience becomes much more fluid.
Interesting.
And that can also address things in different languages too, with longer words. So there's a whole bunch of things to it that can make the mobile experience better.
Yeah.
Cool. I want to switch to some of the questions. I want to make sure we do that, but I want to circle back to you, Rachel. So in addition to some of, so the work you're doing on grid and some of the interesting things that are happening with variable fonts, are there other things that you're excited about that are coming up in the next 9 months, a year? Or are you just kind of like, man, there's so much in grid, or are there other pieces that you're interested in or excited in?
I mean, it's generally everything. I do generally love what is becoming possible in CSS, and the fact that, as the CSS working group, we're looking at the sort of stuff that people are trying to do out there on the web, and maybe they're doing that with JavaScript. And not that JavaScript's a bad thing, but there are a lot of these things are just more performant if we do them in CSS. And so, sort of solving those things, like I was playing around with, I've got a bunch of demos for things like scroll snapping. So you can kind of mirror that sort of app-like experience of snapping from screen to screen. That stuff is really neat. And I just love the fact that we're solving the problems that people have. And they're showing us they've got those problems by coming up with solutions to them. And I think that, for instance, Houdini, which, sort of exposing these APIs, that's going to allow more people to experiment and play around and build their own solutions, or even at least build a kind of prototype of something, which then hopefully we can then bring back into CSS and create in a way that then is available to everyone without you needing to be able to sort of hack into this stuff and build it yourself.
I haven't heard of it. Can you explain that to me? What is Houdini exactly, besides the magician?
Sort of very quickly, basically Houdini is this attempt to sort of expose the low-level APIs behind how layout and things and so on, all sorts of things work in the browser. And the sort of first parts of that are starting to come out into browsers now. So they allow people to, say something like the masonry type layout that people would like to be able to build, being able to put that together themselves using, rather than kind of reverse engineering what browsers do, having real APIs that, so they can actually do something and know it's consistent across browsers. So I think it's allowing people to really experiment and show us what they want. And that's something I care about a lot, and why I wander around talking about this stuff and talking to developers and designers and say, does this work for you? Can we have some feedback? Maybe we can make it better. I care about that. I care about that for the future of the platform. So it's that sort of stuff that excites me. How can I better bring back to the CSS working group and to browser vendors what people want?
I think that's something that I think is really significant over the last couple of years. That at least to me, it's become much more apparent how to have a voice in this process. And I think that's in no small part to the work that you and Jenn have done, Rachel, in raising that awareness. And I think we're trying to do that as well with the variable font specification, putting things on GitHub where it's a little bit more accessible, inviting more and more people into the discussion to recognize how much impact we can have, like as designers and developers, influencing the way the web develops is really tremendous. We need more voices so that we can get people into the discussion and see how we can shape it.
Yeah, and that question comes up, and we'll actually see that question show up, and I'm seeing tons of questions coming into this control panel. So I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. What we typically do is we circle back to some of these questions after the webinar. So just for everyone who's on the call, this webinar will be made available to everyone for free in let's say 5 to 7 days is usually when we kind of put it out there. And I always like to follow up on the questions, because this is, these questions that come up are pretty interesting in my opinion. And so I just want to kind of share a couple of those. And so again, this one comes from Patrick W. I'm excited. I'm saying my control panel's in the way here. I'm excited by being able to align the grid relative to typography and EMS. Are there any guides or examples of this? Again, I'm going to guess that grid by example might have something on this, Rachel.
I don't think I've particularly got anything to do with typography.
Okay.
Trying to think if there's anything. Yeah, I can't think of anything offhand that answers that simply.
Okay.
Well, I think one at least thing to experiment with is, like, I'll usually set a maximum line length in EMS. And so what I've found and because that's relative to the size of the type. So as the type size changes, then so does the relationship in that maximum length. So if you're looking to get around 75 characters per line, there is a CSS size unit called CH. It's not evenly implemented yet, and that is supposed to give you a number of characters. But setting it in EMS around 38 or 39 EMS is going to get you about that same value. So thinking through that kind of relationship in the type, you could apply that same sort of thinking to your layout and sizing things in EMS rather than pixel values or percentages, so that you could have min and max values for elements in the grid that are sized relative to the type. So it takes a little bit of adaptation and experimentation, but I think that you could get there pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, there's also things like being able to use things like min content and max content or fit content that let you have something and it's become the size that it is until it gets to a certain point, and then you can say, no, actually at that point I want you to wrap. So we've got a lot more sizing ability in grid layout and in modern layout in general. It does require some understanding of how big things are on the web, which I think is probably the big thing that people need to sort of learn, because it's different from dealing with everything in percentages.
Speaking of big things that people need to learn, so this is that kind of leads into this from Jesse again, who's asking exactly that. Like, what I mean, I think that obviously we've made the case for grid and to a degree variable fonts. And what other things are there core pieces that you need to know before you start diving into this stuff, or what are the foundations, or what else needs to happen?
I think for layout, it's sizing. It's actually what the different layout methods are really for. Understanding actually right at a basic level, what actually is a float? What's that for?
Right.
What should we be using that for? So just having a proper understanding, not how we've used things in a hacky way, but just actually what are these different layout things to do. But as I say, sizing is going to be really important. Things like writing modes, understanding the fact that new layout methods care about the writing mode of the document. That's really important to understand, because otherwise things are quite confusing. So I think in terms of CSS, it's those things, those kind of core fundamentals of how layout works are really key to be able to sort of embrace and use all the new stuff that's coming up.
Awesome. Jason, anything that you wanted to add to that?
Variable fonts. There's, I think one of the things that's maybe a little bit understood, I think, is in responsive images as we're layering these things in. We had mentioned container queries before.
Right.
And one of the use cases that people talk about with container queries is meaning that the CSS is impacted by the size of the container, like the card layout itself. You can impact the responsive image using source and source set in order to define the rules by which things are replaced to supply just the right image in far more granular detail than simply by the size of the window. It can also be by the proportion of this thing to the size of the window. So I think actually digging more deeply into how source and source set works in responsive images is a really useful thing to really dive deeply into as you're working through these layout things in order to get the best performance.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We are just kind of anecdotally, I'm seeing, so Jason's course on responsive web design, which you can sign up for free, has a forum, and we're seeing a lot of that sort of organic curiosity about like responsive images, and particularly the sizes and source set. There's a great article that the folks at the Filament group just posted, I think like 2 days ago, where they go into this interesting discussion of using sizes and source set, and they kind of create this very cool, almost like a magnifying loop, so that you can place your cursor over an image and it kind of magnifies it, and it's all being done with the sizes and source set, just a little tiny bit of JavaScript. So it's very, very cool. As I mentioned before in our pre-show, we got a lot of interesting code-specific questions for this, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but so this was a question from Rob M. Can I apply display grid or display flex to elements like body, section, article instead of IDs or classes? Rachel, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely, you could apply it to any selector you like. I mean, the reason to use a class would be that then doesn't tie the thing specifically to some HTML element, which might change. You might want to have the same layout on, I don't know, a larger component, and then also, on some small element, which actually is better to be an article rather than a div or what have you. So that's the reason people tend to use classes, is it makes things more reusable. But it doesn't matter what selector you use to create your grid.
Right. And one of the things we didn't talk about too much was, the contrast between grid layout and Flexbox. And so again, I don't want to dive too deep into that, because that's there's lots of articles and stuff that talk about it. But, from the way I usually describe it is, grid layout has a true kind of X and Y, so horizontal and vertical ability to create complex layouts. And Flexbox is really not as powerful. It's usually only one-dimensional, so either horizontal or vertical. Rachel, is that kind of a fair characterization, or how would you?
Yeah. I mean, the spec defines grid as a two-dimensional layout model. So that's you want to align things as a row and a column at the same time, whereas Flexbox is one-dimensional. You are working in a row or a column, and you're sort of pushing things around and distributing space across that one dimension. But if you wrap your flex layout, the things on the second line won't line up with the things above, because you're only working in one dimension. So that's the rough difference. The other difference is, do you want to kind of define everything on the container, on the grid container, set up your grid and things will go into it? Or do you want each item to sort of push around and distribute space? Because the second way is much more of a flex way. You're saying, well, let's make this item as big as it wants to be, and then we'll distribute the space. Whereas grid, you are setting up a grid and placing things on it, which is a different way of working.
Okay. Here's another grid question. How do you designate fixed elements using CSS grid layout? Is this even possible?
Fixed as in position fixed, or fixed as in fixed width?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it wasn't specific enough. So I'm thinking like, yeah, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. When I think fixed element, yeah, so it could be either, right? So if you want something to be positioned at the bottom of a row or a column, that's relatively easy to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can obviously position there. You can also use absolute positioning and so on alongside grid. It maybe works.
Yeah.
I've got to figure out how that's working. There's examples on my site of doing that.
Yeah.
And if they are talking about just fixed sized elements, then yes, you can create fixed tracks and flexible tracks in the same grid without any problem at all. Okay.
And then this one again, it's a little, is Bootstrap 4 an option for Flex and CSS Grid with columns and rows? So I can take this one a little bit, so that Bootstrap 4 so there's actually a whole other webinar about like frameworks and grid layout and all that, but in many ways, Bootstrap 4 now does offer support for Flexbox. However, I don't believe there's something baked in for CSS Grid.
Because you don't need it.
Yeah, exactly.
You could stop using. You could use the rest of it Bootstrap if you wanted to. Stop using the grid and use grid layout instead. You wouldn't need any support in Bootstrap, because the reason that we use things like Bootstrap is that they do the calculations for us. Mm-hmm. And even if you want, because Flexbox is one-dimensional, you still have to do this thing of setting everything in percentage sizing to make it into a grid, because it's one-dimensional. So actually Flexbox is much closer to doing a floated grid than it is to doing grid layout.
Interesting.
So if you want to use grid layout and you still need to use Bootstrap, just stop using the grid and use grid layout for your grid. That'll work absolutely fine. In fact, you can drop a grid component into a Bootstrap layout perfectly happily. Okay. That's fine.
Okay. I think that's the important thing to note about Bootstrap or anything else, is that they are modular and you don't have to use everything about it. If you simply want to use Bootstrap's way of styling form components, you can do that. And that's really, that was the intent from the beginning. I mean, it wasn't an all or nothing kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And now we have this one from Michelle. Any tips for using Flexbox and grid layout on a site running a content management system, e.g. WordPress, or in this case, Perch and Drupal with a theme? So just in general, how does the addition of a content management system complicate things? Does it make it easier? How does that play?
It depends on how terrible the CMS is and how awful the theme is.
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, it's like if you've already got some code and you want to introduce some other code, it's going to depend on how well the existing thing is built. It's going to be harder if you've got something that's very messy and it's very difficult. For instance, if you've got stuff that's got like very specific selectors all over the place, it's very difficult to insert something else in there without things leaking through, or there's all sorts of reasons how a badly built theme could make it hard to implement anything.
Yeah.
But if you've got something that's fairly well built and you want to drop a grid, a gallery component you've built using grid, for example, and you've just got a big content area and you want to put that should work. That should work absolutely fine. There shouldn't be a problem with that. But obviously that it really does depend on what you're using. I mean, I've got my own CMS that I built, and we did that because we wanted something that didn't output a load of junk into your markup. That was a driving force behind building Perch, because a lot of CMSs do spit out a load of extra stuff that you don't want. But I can't speak for other solutions.
Well, we ended up at Isovera working on, over the past year, on integrating Pattern Lab into a Drupal 8 theme. And so we did everything we could to kind of get all of the markup out of the Drupal templates and into the Pattern Lab patterns. So we had a lot of the junk cleared out, and we were able, on this project I mentioned earlier, to start to bring grid into that in a very modular and isolated way. And so we're able to bring it in on the component level, try it out using it in a few different places, and it's now kind of working its way out into the rest of the theme. But you know, that's we had a known starting point, so it was a little easier for us to do that.
Yeah. And this is going to have to be the last question because we're almost, we are at the end of our time. So and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, and this comes from Amy C. How can I help making CSS better? What are the ways to contribute to the CSS spec? So I know, Rachel, you've got some interesting things to say about that, but how can people help?
Well, yeah, so all of the CSS working group stuff is now on GitHub. So all of the specs are on GitHub, and crucially, the issues against the spec are on GitHub, which means that you can go to GitHub and you can raise an issue against any spec and say, you know, I think that this should behave like this, or I've run into a problem like that, and it will be listened to. It takes a long time. So, you know, there's an awful lot of CSS, and there are actually very few spec editors, and so you can post something and not hit anything for months. That doesn't mean it's been ignored. It means we've not got around to discussing that thing just yet, because there's just an awful lot of it. So, in general, I mean, if anyone raises anything against a spec that I've got anything to do with, I mean, I'm co-editor of multi-column layouts. If you raise a multi-column layout issue, I will promise to look at it and, you know, and get that discussed when we're discussing those things. And generally, there's an interest there. The other thing you can do is search and see what is already being discussed and add your thoughts. You know, there's people discussing like masonry type layout and so on. You know, go and add your use cases. You know, it is wanted and needed, and people do care. It's just the process is slower than you might like. You know,
I think the important thing especially for non-developers, to understand is that when we talk about these issues, that is simply a discussion of a thing, and so by searching for it, looking in the github.com/w3c, searching in there for the CSS working group drafts and the issues, you can find the discussion about the thing that's not working the way you want, and it is that documentation that is so key. It's so helpful for people to weigh in and say, here's what I tried, and this is what happened, and I really wish it would work this way, and post some screenshots, post some notes. It is that documentation and explanation of what it is that we as designers and developers want that will help shape that discussion.
Yeah, I would agree. That's great. And to everyone who's watching and at any point, I would say, you know, realize that in many ways, the web design and development community is actually much smaller than you might think. And so in some ways, and so even though it's huge, you know, folks generally in this industry, I feel like a lot of us are drawn to this because we like sharing and we like, discussing the work, and it's open. So don't feel intimidated. You know, when you go to conferences or if you go to meetups, you know, if you're writing blog posts or sending emails, like feel free. You know, everyone is an equal member of the community, is my opinion. Some of us have more experience than others, but in the end, like, just, you know, don't feel intimidated is my kind of take on it. This industry changes daily, weekly, monthly. Nobody knows it all. Trust me.
We all learn by viewing source.
Yeah, I just shared a link, if perhaps we can push that out to people.
Sure.
I did a talk last year for CSS Come for You, which was entitled "Where Does CSS Come From?" And that really just talks about the whole process and, you know, how we create CSS and how it gets into browsers, and just that might be helpful to anyone who's interested in finding out what actually goes on at CSS Working Group. Okay,
so that is on YouTube. Where does CSS come from? What we're going to be doing is, we do have to wrap this up because we're slightly over. But what I'd like to say, first of all, is thank you to both my guests. This was fantastic talk. I wish it could go on forever. For the folks who are watching, you know, we will be putting the link to the recording shortly, and you can look at our Twitter feed at Aquint Gymnasium. You also see it on mine, so at Jeremias is my Twitter feed. And the other thing that I'll be doing is we got a lot more great questions, and they just kept on rolling in. And so what I'd like to do is kind of create a response article to some of those questions, and we'll post the link along with the video to this as well. So thank you both. This was fantastic, Jason and Rachel. Thanks for taking your time out. Any last pieces, anything that you want to promote? I know that you're both doing Event Apart in Seattle, and that's actually, I'll be there as well doing a web panel. So that's in 2 weeks. Anything else that you want to talk about before we sign off?
Well, if people are curious to find out more about variable fonts in depth, I'm going to be doing a full day workshop with front-end masters in June. I think front-end masters will have information up about that shortly.
Okay.
But middle of June, and then subscribers can see it online, or if you want to come hang out with me in Minneapolis, that'd be awesome.
Cool. Excellent. And Rachel, in addition to the book and anything else that you want to talk about?
Yeah, well, I'm speaking all over the place this year. I'm trying to get my site updated at rachelshines.co.uk/speaking is where I'd sort of list where I'm going to be. You know, come and say hello if you happen to be at any of those events, and let me know, what you think about Grid or anything else. It's nice to talk to people.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm going to go shovel some snow, I think, and we'll go from there. So once again, thanks so much for participating, and thanks for everyone who watched.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
both.
Take care. Bye-bye.